Good morning. Today we will be reading chapter 4 and 5 in our book called Wish.
Good morning.
I figured Bertha was going to be mad at me for kicking that girl, but she surprised me by putting her arm around me and saying, "Tomorrow's a new day." Then she gave me a little squeeze and added, "Personally, I love those boots." She didn't say one word about my inappropriate behavior. Mama would have hollered at me and reminded me for the umpteenth time that I was a troublemaker like Scrappy. After supper that day, we had blueberry pie for dessert, and I got to make my wish. If you cut off a pointed end of a slice of pie and save it for last, you can make a wish when you eat it. I had learned that from my cousin Melvin, who swore it had worked for him when his brother ran off and got married and left him with the bedroom all to himself. I knew Gus and Bertha were watching me cut off that pointed piece and push it to the edge of my plate, but they didn't say anything. Even Bertha had been kind of quiet during supper. Maybe she really was mad at me for kicking Audrey. Maybe she was thinking, the apple don't fall far from the tree. Maybe that night in bed, she and Gus would whisper to each other how much I am like Scrappy, and what in the world had they gotten themselves into when they agreed to let me stay with them. After I ate that little pointed piece of pie and made my wish, I went out front to watch Gus do some weeding in the vegetable garden. A fluffy black cat rubbed against my legs, purring up a storm. I wrote my name in the dirt with a stick and then scribbled it out. There wasn't one blade of grass in that yard, just dirt and rocks, with sprinkles of color here and there, patches of wildflowers nestled around the clothesline post, the pink blooms of a dogwood tree over by the driveway, a neat row of daffodils lined up like soldiers along the edge of the chicken wire fence that surrounded the garden. Gus whistled while he hoed around the tiny tomato plants, stepping carefully between the pole beans and zucchini that were just beginning to poke through the warm spring dirt. On my very first day in Colby, Bertha had said to Gus, "Let's take Charlie on a tour of the garden." So I followed along behind them while they pointed out each little plant, telling me how the pole beans were going to climb up the twine and the zucchini would have giant yellow flowers. I had nodded and said, "Oh, 'cause what else can you say about vegetables in a garden?" But Gus, you would have thought that was the Garden of Eden out there, the way he took care of it. Amazingly, each new leaf on the okra plants or mowing a squash vine off the walking path. So while I scribbled in the red dirt, Gus whistled and hoed. Every now and then he tugged on the bill of his cap and swatted at mosquitoes. I could hear Bertha in the kitchen talking to some of the cats while she fed them, scolding one of them for killing a bird, telling another that he was getting too fat. I was about to go back inside when something caught my eye. There was movement behind a tangle of shrubs that separated the yard from the woods. The black cat darted off, disappearing behind the shed over by the garden. I stood real still and squinted in the darkness of the woods. All of a sudden, a dog poked its head out from behind the bushes. A skinny brown and black dog with long floppy ears. The same dog that I saw fighting this afternoon. He looked at me and cocked his head. I took one slow tiptoeing step towards him. He ducked his head back a little, watching me. I took another step, and quick as lightning, he ran off into the woods. "Dang it," I said. "You say something?" Gus called from the garden. "There was a dog over there," I pointed to the bushes. "Brown and black, floppy ears?" "Yeah," I said. "Did you see him?" "No, but I've seen him plenty of times before." "Who does he belong to?" Gus propped the hoe against the fence and sat in a lawn chair in the yard. "Oh, you know, just an old wild stray," he said. "Been hanging around here for months. Bertha keeps putting table scraps out for him. He don't mind eating her meatloaf, but he doesn't want nothing to do with her." I looked towards the woods. "I bet I can catch him," I said. Gus took off his baseball cap and scratched his head. "That old mutt is mighty skittish." "If I can catch him, can I keep him?" "I think that dog would rather be a stray," he said. But I knew better. I knew what it felt like to be a stray. not having a home where somebody wanted you. And he was a fighter, like me, that dog. That dog and I had a lot in common. I was suddenly overwhelmed with love for that skinny dog. I made a solemn vow and promise to myself right then and there that dog was going to be mine. Chapter 5. I thought I was glad when the weekend came because I didn't have to go to school. But then Bertha told me we were going to church on Sunday. I hadn't been to church since I was little. Scrappy never wanted any part of it, calling those people do-gooders and Bible thumpers. But Mama took me and Jackie for a while. I don't remember much about it except Jackie whining and complaining on the way there until Mama slapped her legs and told her to hush up. But then Mama got too nervous to drive and wouldn't take off her bathrobe or even comb her hair, so we stopped going. When I walked into Bertha's kitchen on Sunday morning, she looked me up and down and said, "Oh, dear." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Do you have a dress?" I looked down at my jeans that were too short and my t-shirt that used to be Jackie's and shook my head. Bertha flapped her hand at me. "Well, that's okay. We'll go shopping this week." Then Gus came in the kitchen and I didn't hardly even recognize him. He had on a coat and tie. Instead of his usual muddy boots, he wore lace-up black shoes, buffed and shiny. He could have passed for one of those fancy rich bankers over in Rowley, except for the garden dirt under his fingernails, and his hair squashed flat from his baseball cap. He sat at the kitchen table and Bertha kissed his cheek. "Well, look at you," she said, making him blush, and swatted her hand over his shoulder. He kept pulling at his collar and wiping sweat off the back of his neck. After breakfast, we headed down to the mountain to Rocky Creek Baptist Church. When I got inside, I knew right away why Bertha had said, "Oh dear," when she saw me that morning. The other girls in church wore dresses. I couldn't look anybody in the eye, knowing my face was beet red and my jeans were all wrong. I sat on the hard wooden pew sandwiched between Gus and Bertha. While the organist played church music, more and more people filled in, smiling and nodding at one another. Then Bertha poked me and whispered, "There's the Odmans." I glanced up to see Howard and his family carrying their Bibles and making their way to the pew across the aisle. 5 boys with slicked down hair poking each other and clomping too loud in their Sunday shoes. Their mama chatted with folks, asking about their sick grandmas and making on over their babies while the red-headed daddy mopped his face with a handkerchief. After a prayer and a hymn, the kids had to go to their Sunday school class. Imagine my surprise when I got to my class and there was Audrey Mitchell. She looked at me all wide-eyed, like I was a Martian right off of a spaceship. I sat as far away as I could from her, and then Howard came in with his up-down walk and sat right next to me. Our Sunday school teacher was a gray-haired, wrinkly-faced woman named Mrs. Mackley. She didn't waste 1 minute telling everybody that my name was Charlie Reese, and please welcome me to the church family. She had taught us a song called Good Old Noah. Howard sang louder than anybody, and personally, I thought it was a little too embarrassing, but nobody else seemed to pay him any mind. After that, Mrs. Mackley told us we were going to play a game called Bible Detective. She would read questions from her Bible, detective cards, and whenever you answered one right, you got a Bible buck. When you got enough Bible bucks, you could cash them in for a prize. While she read the questions, the boy fidgeted and the girls whispered and giggled in their dresses, while I kept quiet in my ugly jeans. How many braids were in Samson's hair? Name the man who went down into a pit on a snowy day to kill a lion. In what book, chapter, and verse can we read about a winner of a beauty contest becoming a queen? Howard's hand shot up every time, and I knew for sure I was never going to win any Bible bucks. After Sunday school, all the grown-ups and kids gathered in the fellowship hall. Bertha parted me around like I was a beauty queen, introducing me to everybody and making on over me and saying how lucky she and Gus were to have me staying with them. People nodded and said, "Ain't that nice?" and stuff like that. But I bet they were wondering why my own mama and daddy couldn't take care of me and didn't know girls don't wear jeans to church. When Bertha introduced me to Howard's mama, she hugged me and said Howard had told her all about me. Then she craned her neck, looking around the room. Mr. Oldman must be outside, and I'll never catch those wild boys of mine long enough to introduce you. Some of the Oldman boys chased each other around the room, their ties loose and their shirt tails flapping. They grabbed brownies off the paper plates while Howard showed everybody his Bible box. But you come on by the house any time, okay? Mrs. Oldman said. Bertha grinned at me. Now, wouldn't that be nice, Charlie? I nodded and said, yes, ma'am, because I knew that's what I was supposed to say. When we finally climbed into the car and headed back to the mountains towards home, I scanned the woods and yards along the way, hoping I'd see that stray dog again. But I didn't. What did I see, though, was a truck full of hay. Jackie's friend Casey told me if you count to 13 when you see a truck full of hay, you can make a wish. So, of course, that's exactly what I did. Things at school seemed to get worse every day. My homework papers came back all marked up by Mrs. Willoughby in red pencil with notes like, see me, and try again. Sometimes I didn't even do my homework. It seemed like a waste of time since I wasn't going to be there much longer. Once in a while, Bertha asked me if I had homework, and I was pretty good at just shrugging and changing the subject. Besides, I was used to getting marked up papers like that, because back in Rowley, I wasn't exactly student of the year. Jackie was the only one who ever fussed at me for not going to school and not doing my homework. But I reminded her that she was not my mother, so she should leave me alone. When my teachers called the house to tell Mama how bad I'd done on my math test and ask why I hadn't turned in my book report, Mama would holler and carry on for about 5 minutes, and then she'd throw up her skinny arms and heave a big sigh before she said, "What's the use?" Then she'd shuffle out of the room in her bedroom slippers, muttering about how she didn't deserve that aggravation. At least in Rowley, I had friends at school, but here, when I sat at a table in the cafeteria, girls made faces like they smelled something bad and slid their trays away from me. Most days, I pretended like I had a stomachache and spent the afternoon in the nurse's office, drawing more stars and hearts on my arm with a marker. At recess, Howard followed me around, reminding me he was my backpack buddy and asking questions a mile a minute. Do you ever visit your daddy in jail? Why ain't your sister here too? You want some of those Bible bucks? Sometimes I answered him, and sometimes I didn't. The thing about Howard was everything just rolled right off of him. It seemed like nothing bothered him one little bit. It was clear that nobody at school wanted much to do with him, but he didn't seem to mind. His brother Dwight was always surrounded by cussing, punching, ball-tossing, fist-bumping boys, but Howard never joined them. A couple of times when I rode into town with Gus and Bertha, I'd seen his older brothers Burl and Lenny tossing a football or shooting hoops with their friends. But Howard would be sitting on the steps scribbling in a notebook over by the garage, fiddling with his bicycle. Bertha had commented about him one day when we drove by. That poor boy is too much of a loner, she said. Nothing wrong with that, Gus said. Bertha shook her head. Not for a child. Children need friends, Bertha sighed. I don't get it. He's just as sweet as can be. I bet it's because of his up-down walk, I said. Well, that's mean, she said. She turned around to face me. You're going to make so many new friends here in Colby, Charlie. I just know it. I stared out the window and pretended like I wasn't even listening to her go on and on about all the things that I could do, like Girl Scouts and 4-H. She told me about her friend Jolene, who lived in Fairview, and she had a daughter my age. We would visit them on some Saturday if I wanted, or maybe we could go to the mall down in Asheville. On and on she went, talking as if my life in Colby was going to be like living in Disney World. You're going to talk that girl's head plumb off, Bertha, Gus said. Bertha laughed and slapped him playfully on the arm. Where do you think that dog is? I asked Gus. Could be anywhere, he said. That mutt, he gets around. I'd been looking everywhere for that stray dog. I'd seen him twice since that day he'd come to Gus and Bertha's, but both times he darted off into the woods when he saw me. "He sure loves my meatloaf, I can tell you that," Bertha said. He licks that pan clean and then hightails it right out of there so fast I can hardly get as much of a glimpse of him. I leaned back against the seat and sighed. I bet I was never going to catch that dog. And what if I did? Could I really keep him? Mama would probably have a hissy fit, but I bet Scrappy would call from jail and tell her to stop her yammering and let me have a dog if I wanted one. Then, as we were turning onto the main road into town, I saw a black horse out in the field eating grass and swishing its tails at flies. I shook my head as if 3 times and made my wish. That was the rule for black horse wishing. If you see a white horse, just make 1 wish. But for a black horse, you have to shake your fist at it 3 times. I learned that from one of Scrappy, which made me a little skeptical, but I did it anyway. Shook my fist and made my wish. And that's it for today. Have a good day. Bye.